Our last topic this week is going to be on adding materials to your objects. And we can see under the attribute editor here, if I select one of my objects, that there is a node at the very end, which is the material node. And Lambert 1 is the default material for the Maya viewport. So whenever we are adding materials to our scene, we don't want to be changing any of the specifications here under the Lambert 1 tab. We're going to want to add a new material and then adjust all of the values in here to in the attribute editor in order to customize our material. So there's a couple ways you can add materials. If we go to our rendering tab and we go under lighting and shading, you can assign a new material here, or you can assign a favorite material. And these are some of the standard, Maya materials. And so these Maya materials will render in Arnold. Arnold also has its own material shaders. So we're going to be talking about these materials here, what makes them different, these shaders, excuse me. So these materials are different shaders, and those shaders are a kind of standard which you then use to kind of customize the look of your material. And the difference between most of these is the way that light reflects off of the objects, the kind of shininess of that object. And so Lambert, being one that doesn't have any specularity at all, it's a flat matte material. So let's go ahead and put a new Lambert material onto this cylinder here. So I can go, under the rendering tab and find it here. I can also, under the rendering shelf, here are all of my material shaders. So this would be the Lambert material shader. So I'm going to add a Lambert to it. And now you see we have Lambert 2 has been created. So some of the different attributes that I'm able to customize here are color. So I can just double click in this color bar and I can change the color of my material. I'm able to add transparency to it. If I want to make it, let me frame it up here so we can see. I can make it transparent in the scene. And what I'd like to do actually is, before I do this, add a couple lights to my scene just so I'm able to see in my Arnold render view just what these materials look like as they're being rendered. So let me add maybe 2 spotlights. I'm going to duplicate that spotlight, rotate it out, and move it. And I'm going to want to move it in the world space. So let me go to my tool settings, change this over to world, and move this over. And then I'm going to select both these spotlights here, and I'm just going to move them up in the scene. I think I also need to increase the intensity by a lot here. And let's work in shader mode 7. Okay, let me collapse this down. And I want to run the IPR here. Okay, so now we're starting to see something happening in our scene. And I want to increase the intensity of this spotlight as well. That might be a bit much. Let's see if I decrease it just by a little bit. Start to see how this is looking and rendering in our scene. Let me bump this intensity down a bit too. Yeah, I think about 100 is probably good. Highlight my spotlight, bump this down to 100. Okay, so we can see here that Lambert, even though there's a spotlight shining on this material, that it doesn't give us any, it's not reflecting any light off of it. It's a matte material. Let me talk about another standard shader here, which would be Blinn. And if I assign Blinn to this cube, I can go ahead and again change the color, change the transparency. Let me give it a kind of bluish color. Okay, I can make it transparent, which I need to add something to my Arnold renderer in order to be able to see the transparency. Ambient color kind of gives a kind of glow to the material. You don't see it here necessarily, but you can see it here in this viewport. And incandescence also turns this object into a kind of light. And we can't really see the specularity on this cube. Let's see if I move my, my spotlight over, if you're able to kind of see how the light bounces off this object. And perhaps it would be easier if we did this with a sphere. I'm also able to, okay, here's our specularity settings down here. I'm also able to change what kind of material I'm working with here in the attribute editor. So if I don't want to be using a Lambert type, I can just go ahead and change this to a blend on my sphere, on my cylinder, excuse me. And we can see if I just shine this spotlight on to my cylinder, I'm starting to get a little bit of a kind of shininess because of this blue object next to our cylinder. So you can kind of see how the Blinn differs from Lambert as far as changing the type of reflectivity that we're seeing. So there's no reflectivity. And here we start to get some reflectivity. So we're able to change some other really specific parameters like diffuse, which changes the way that the light is spread around the object, and so it affects the kind of, you can see the kind of smoothness or sharpness of this kind of line here. And down in specular shading, we're able to increase the kind of shiny color that gets reflected here from the light, how bright that is or how dim it is. And if we bring it all the way down, it's basically to turn this material back into kind of Lambert shader. And then we have something called reflectivity, which if we increase this, will make this object much more reflective. You can bump this down to nothing. Oop, that's a specular color. Reflectivity, we can kind of bump that down and it becomes a little bit softer. And then if we increase the reflected color, it will increase how kind of metallic, let's say, this object is. So now we're really getting this cube reflected in this Blinn. I just want to, for a minute, show you the difference, which is why we're using Arnold. Okay, let me go ahead and render the scene in the render view. Okay, this is what the scene looks like in Arnold. And this is what the scene looks like in Maya software. So you can see a huge difference in the quality of the render. We're not getting any reflectivity here at all. And then Maya, well, that was Maya software. Now let's do Maya hardware. Maya hardware doesn't even, the lights are too bright for the scene. But again, you can see this kind of very harsh edge. So the Arnold renderer is worth the render time wait. The results can be a lot more photorealistic. And you have more things that you can kind of play with as far as the look of your materials. A couple other materials that I want to mention are the Phong and the Phong E. Let me go ahead and I'm going to make this instead. Now that we have, I have this cylinder as a Blinn, I'm going to go ahead and make this sphere. I'm sorry, this cube. I'm going to change this to be a Lambert, just so we have one Lambert in the scene. Okay. And maybe I'm going to give it a bit of incandescence so it'll kind of glow. Let me open back up my Arnold render view here and run the IPR. And let me now work on this sphere here, and let me add another material. Again, I can use the shelf here. I can work in the rendering tab under lighting and shading, or I can right click on the object and I can assign a new material down here. I've been using these favorite materials because these are some of the standard shaders that you're going to be using a lot, but you can also assign a new material, and then you get an exhaustive list of all the different kind of shaders. Some of these shaders are much more complicated, and we're not going to get into how to use them and how to manipulate them, but up here we have some of like the basic shaders, and then we also find our Arnold shaders. So here I'm going to create a Phong on my sphere, and let me move my camera over a little bit so I'm able to see my sphere. And so you can see here that a Phong has a certain type of characteristics to specularity, and it changes some of the, this type of shader has a little bit of different parameters you can play with. So let's go back to blend, and you see the specular shading's different and the way that it renders this light is different. And if we have it as a Phong, again, that changes this kind of softness of the light and the surface quality of this material. So let me go ahead and give it a kind of yellow color, maybe like a mustard yellow or something, I'm not sure. And down here under specular shading, I can change this thing called cosine power, and that'll change the kind of softness or fall off here of the light as it reflects off of the object. I can make it a really small kind of point, which makes it a little bit more shiny and reflective. Again, I have this reflectivity option, which will make it much more kind of metallic looking. Let me go ahead and rotate around this. And let me move my light a little bit so we're able to see this side of the sphere a little bit more. Okay, and you can see in the sphere, and because these are spotlights, let me actually make the spotlight a little bit softer as it wraps around. Let me do it to both spotlights here. Let me add a little bit of this penumbra angle so that I'm able to get a little bit more of a softness to the light. Okay, now that looks a little bit more realistic. And in this, there we go, I want to zoom in the scene. And you know, I'm starting to get a little bit of a reflectivity here. Let me go ahead and if I turn up that specular color or turn it down, it disappears, or it's a little bit smaller here. And you know, the reflectivity is all the way up. And if I bump up the reflective color as well, then I'm able to, I have something that looks very reflective, a surface that looks very reflective. Let me go ahead and move this object back, maybe move it a little bit closer to my sphere so we can really kind of see how this reflects. And move this a little bit closer also. So you can really start to play with some fun things. Now you see here we are getting this kind of noise again. And so I would have to like refer to that help guide, that troubleshooting noise in Arnold. I would want to go and refer to that to see, okay, this is a kind of reflective noise, and so, or it looks like a kind of maybe reflective and specular noise. So what are my render settings that I need to be able to fix this noise here? Okay, so this is what the Phong looks like. Let me also, just because it's good practice, this one's at quadratic decay, and let me change this to quadratic decay also. Just trying to maybe get these to look a little bit more like this scene. But I think actually because I have the reflectivity turned up that it's turning it white in our viewport. That's okay. And then the final one, so Phong and Phong-E are really similar. They have a little bit of different parameters here. For this one, let me go ahead and assign an anisotropic. An anisotropic means that the specularity isn't spherical. It's in a kind of wave that you're able to adjust. So let me move over here to my cube. To my cone. And this cone is pretty, I didn't want to kind of soften this cone, I think, before I mess around with it. So let me increase its subdivisions. And let's see if I can't, I don't want to change the height of you. Okay, that's looking a little better. I added some subdivisions in the Y direction as well. So now I have a kind of smoother looking cone. Let me go back to my anisotropic here. Again, I can change the color. Maybe I'll give it a kind of red hue. And down here under specular shading, I'm able to change the angle of this specular shape. And a cone is a little bit hard to tell how it's working. Let me go ahead and add and change this sphere now over to maybe an anisotropic shader, so we can kind of see how this line see how the line of the specularity kind of changes. Let me move this over a little bit and go into my anisotropic and change the angle here. So I can change the spread, how wide that specular line is. I can change the angle of it. Okay, so this will give you kind of like a brushed metal look on the anisotropic. So those are some of the basic material shaders for Maya. We also have an Arnold renderer, an Arnold shader. And so let me go ahead and create a new object. Maybe I'll do a torus, and let me pull this torus out here, and let me pull my lights back a little bit also so I can see my torus. I'm going to rotate this light in a little bit. Okay, I have a kind of nice even shading on my torus. Again, it's a Lambert 1 shader. Okay, that's the default material here. So instead of Lambert 1, and let me add a little bit more, couple more subdivisions to this object so it's a little bit smoother. And now if I go under the Arnold tab, just kidding, it's not under the Arnold tab. I don't know if it's here under the shelf or not, but the way I can add an Arnold shader is to assign a new material. And under the Arnold shaders, the one that I would recommend working with is this AI Standard Surface Shader. So I'm going to go ahead and turn that on. And it actually, the initial Standard Surface Shader is a lot more shiny. We have for each of the kind of subcategories in the attribute editor for this surface shader, we have something called weight, and this will determine how determine the opacity, I would say, of all of these different options, or just how much it's influencing these options. So for color, if I turn the weight on the color down, it's going to turn the color down. If I turn roughness up, it's going to render this material a lot more flat. If I turn the weight on the specularity down, it's also going to turn this object into a kind of flat matte material. So if I the weight down, the weight all the way down, none of this is influencing the object. But if I turn it up, now it starts to. So in this surface shader, there are some presets that you can use here to give you different materials that look like, you know, real world materials. At least a place to kind of start. I can do something like rubber, and I can replace all of the material, or I can kind of blend it with the material I already have. So if I replace the rubber here, now I have a kind of all of these specifications have changed in order to make this look like rubber. So then there's something called transmission, and the transmission has to do with the kind of material under the kind of surface gloss. So that's under subsurface here, and transmission actually is the way that light would pass through. Okay, sorry, the subsurface is how the quality of the material underneath what would then be like maybe a top coat. If you think about something like car paint has a kind of lacquered finish to it, and then how that surface underneath is treated would be that subsurface category. Coat would be that top surface category, and this is where you can change things like roughness on the coat, kind of finishing coat to the material. You can turn this coat on a little bit, and you can start to see that maybe we get a little bit of a kind of shininess to the top of this material. Um, Transmission are the is where how you would adjust for light kind of bending through the material, how it scatters through the material. There's some others here that you can kind of mess around with and do some investigating on your own of how to manipulate some of these subcategories under the attribute editor yourself. But we have the standard ones that we have for these Maya shaders also, which is like the base kind of color. Metalness will turn up how reflective this object is. Now you really can start to see the kind of polygon primitiveness of this with all of these divisions here. We would want to maybe smooth this object out, or I want to actually go ahead and increase the axes divisions, and that might help. So go ahead and you can, change some of these or play around with some of the presets here. So that's what a balloon looks like. So I guess it's like a mylar balloon. So we have a certain type of red color for specularity. We have a red color here. You can change all of this. We have the metalness turned all the way up because it's a kind of mylar and it's very shiny. And then we can see if there's anything else that's been added here. We have coat added, and so coat has certain parameters to it. So I would play around with some of these presets and see exactly what the different subcategories, what their assigned values are. We have maybe clay, right? So we have a little bit of a different kind of texture that's been applied to this shader also.